Welcome to Discovering Africa Thru Technology, the podcast series that showcases the brilliance of Africa's great minds, innovators, and experts as they tackle complex challenges with homegrown solutions driven by knowledge, technology, and innovation. Our podcast is inspired by the African Union Agenda 2063 Aspiration 7, which seeks to rebrand Africa and change negative narratives and perspectives through science, technology, and innovation. We believe that Africa has the power to solve its own development challenges and become a strong, united, resilient, peaceful, and influential global player and partner. Join us as we explore the transformative potential of technology in Africa with your host, Raziah Quallatein Mwawanga, and learn from the experts driving change on the African continent.
Welcome back to Discovering Africa Through Technology, the podcast where Africa tells her own story through innovation, purpose, and human impact. A space where we cut through the noise to celebrate the real visionaries, researchers, innovators, and builders creating solutions from the ground up. At Discovering Africa Through Technology, we believe Africa is not waiting for the future, but Africa is building it through science, technology, and human-centered innovation. And today's conversation speaks directly to one of the most important but overlooked challenges in the global innovation ecosystem. Because sometimes the problem is not the innovation, the problem is whether the world understands it. Today's episode, Beyond Breakthroughs, Innovation Communicated, we are exploring why many science-led startups are winning on innovation but losing on communication. From climate tech and health tech to artificial intelligence and deep tech, founders around the world are building breakthrough solutions, but many still struggle to communicate complex science clearly to investors, regulators, partners, and the public without losing trust, accuracy, or credibility. Our guest today is helping to solve exactly that problem. She is not just observing the future of innovation communication, she is helping to build it. Joining us is Eva Kagiri-Kalanzi, an international development expert, science communication strategist, and innovation ecosystem leader working at the intersection of research, ethical artificial intelligence, and global innovation systems. For nearly 2 decades, Eva has worked with research organizations, academics, funders, and science-led businesses across the UK, Africa, and international innovation ecosystems, helping complex ideas move beyond laboratories, policy papers, technical jargon into real-world understanding, visibility, and impact. She has helped shape Africa UK research collaboration, advised on Finland-Africa science and innovation policy initiatives, and contributed to global conversations on equitable partnerships, inclusion, and the future of research communication. But what makes Eva work especially powerful is this. She identified a global problem hiding in plain sight, the communication gap in science-led innovation. Not because the science is weak, but because innovation alone does not guarantee understanding. And instead of simply talking about the problem, she decided to build a solution. AI for Strategic Communication and Engagement, AISCE, governed AI-powered communication platform designed for science-led startups, a platform created to help innovators communicate complex science responsibly, strategically, and consistently while keeping humans firmly at the center of the process. Because in today's economy, building the breakthrough is no longer enough. The world must understand it too. This is not just about the content, it is about trust, visibility, credibility, and making sure groundbreaking innovation do not remain invisible simply because they were poorly communicated. Welcome to Discovering Africa Through Technology podcast, Eva Kagiri-Kalanzi. To start our conversation, how did your professional journey with science communication start?
Thanks, Razia. I must say that is a very thorough introduction. I don't even think my CV does justice to that accolade you've given me. My background is actually in engineering, and I started as an environmental engineer. That's the path I began with. And while I was doing that, I decided that I wanted to do something which had human impact and visible human impact. Is that I'm not just an engineer and I can't just be an engineer. So I went ahead and did a degree in social science, and that's when I did international development. Anybody who's jumped from a hard science like engineering or something else like that will tell you that going into social science can be very difficult because it's a very different kind of space, the terminologies, the theories, the thinking. And I think the first year of my master's degree was probably one of the most difficult journeys I've ever taken. But as I went through it, I also started to understand what it actually means to design things and to build things that are purposely about improving human lives. So this was probably one of the best decisions I both an engineering and a social science degree. When I finished my studies, I went straight into really doing those kinds of projects where I was combining these two things together. So I used to develop things like energy systems, sanitation systems, and most of my work ended up being in different African countries. So, for instance, I did quite a little bit in Tanzania. I spent a bit of time in Arusha developing some sanitation systems. And then I went into energy. After some time, I thought, oh, I want to do more. So I went into energy systems and I spent quite a bit of time doing work around renewable energy. And I was very interested in energy access. When I went into energy access, again, these things around gender and dimensions came. So all along my work, I've always been a person who's interested in technology, but not just technology, but technology that works for humanity. So this has always been at the back of my mind. As I was going through that journey, thinking like I knew everything around implementation of programs, how programs are funded, felt that sometimes there was a big disconnect, for instance, between policy and this implementation. And I saw an opportunity to get into science, technology, and innovation policy, and that completely changed things for me. So I found myself in a role where I was this liaison person between universities and policymakers at high level. EU Africa policy dialogue. So this is where the discussions around the research and innovation partnerships between the EU and Africa happen. Space where they discuss what are their priorities. And this is actually the space where decisions around which things the EU is going to fund on research in Africa or with Africa, if we say that, with Africa happens. So I was working in that space for 6 years. And so I found myself working with policymakers at that high level, and then policymakers at the Finnish national level, and then researchers. So I worked quite closely with academics. And this is the time when I saw how difficult sometimes it was for researchers to tell narratives, being able to articulate clearly about the value of their work. They were all specialists in very specific areas, and they used to struggle sometimes to show the value of the work they're doing on human impact. And this issue around impact, it was starting to grow. It hadn't yet grown. I think it's in the last 10 years or so when research impact has become a very, very big thing. And this has become a big thing, especially in the global north, funnily enough. But African researchers have actually always done research that is about impact. And that's because the basis of most research that's done in Africa comes from the point of I need to solve a problem that exists in my country. So they've been always quite good at doing that kind of research, but what hasn't normally translated is the ability of African researchers to then tell the story of the impact of their work, even though it's very clear that this is sort of the basis of most research that comes from Africa. So I started to see a bit of these issues, among other things, the imbalances around global north, global south partnerships, which is another area I then have gone into, so that I moved from Finland into UK and I started working for a university here. I used to sit with colleagues whose job within the university was research impact. That was for me, I think, the first time I was able to go really deep into understanding how narratives are developed, the importance of showing and demonstrating what your research is actually contributing to society, regardless of what it is. And among those colleagues, there was one who already had a background in research communication. And he had been doing research. He did a bachelor's in science, and then he'd gone on to do science writing. He'd started a company, and then he'd left the company and come to the university. And we used to have conversations. And one point he told me, you know what, I think you will be quite interested to join me to come and work with me on research communication. And at that time, I thought it was interesting, but I wasn't ready. I left the university, but we kept in touch. I went and did something else, which was this massive program I was leading around Africa UK research management. So I did that for about 3 years. And then after 3 years, when I felt that I had contributed enough, wrote to him and we had a discussion. He's like, I think you really need to come and work with me on research communication. And that's how I then got into research communication. So we are not talking that long ago. We are talking something like 2022 to 2023 there. I started working with him and other people, but it's technically it's his company. He'd already started it like 2011, and we started working together on research communication. And this completely opened my eyes into new dimensions of this conversation we are having today.
From an engineer to social science, doing more technology to policy dialogues and research, you have well articulated your understanding of the problems, your experience and what you've gone through. You've really internalized and you really understand the ecosystem and the problem. Most of these researchers, engineers, they are not communicators, or they are not even marketers or storytellers. So you find that communication is already a problem. So in your experience, what are the biggest mistakes that science-led startups make when trying to communicate complex innovation, and how could they do it differently?
I've spent pretty much half of my life in Finland. And if you know anything about Finland, you will know that, for instance, they are the ones who own Nokia. They are an economy that is built on innovations and developing very interesting technologies, and both in tech and other areas. And so there's no shortage of engineers in Finland. So engineering is a very big thing there. And one thing I remember we always used to say about Finland was they're very good at developing these different products, but they're not very good about talking about them. And one of the things that we always used to joke about is, for an engineer, the mindset always is the technology is so good, it should sell itself. And this is where you see the discrepancy between something that is made in the US and something that comes from a niche country like Finland. So the US will produce a technology that's not as good as coming maybe from a country like Finland. But they are so good at selling it to you, you end up buying that product. And I think this is what tends to happen with most innovators. Innovators, they know how robust or how good whatever it is they are working on is. And you think that because it's so good, you have looked at competitors, you've seen what's out there, and you know your product or your solution is the best. You come with this assumption that surely it should sell itself. But the problem is only you and probably other people who are in your sector, maybe who are working, if you're in medtech, are the only ones who really understand why it's so good. And so science-led startups and innovators tend to struggle with being able to translate that goodness into a language that people can understand. And what we found is that the translation is about how you tell the narrative. You don't just need buy-in from your consumers. This is the one thing they make a mistake about. They assume that if I sell this to the people who I want to buy, that's enough. No, you need to create a communication ecosystem that goes beyond those people. And that is what strategic communication is about. It's about you talking about your work, about your innovation to a wider group than the typical customer. So it's about having a narrative that person like me has no interest at all in med tech can be able to understand what your company develops. Why is what you do important? What is the value of your thing to me as a person who's not a specialist? I'm not your typical, I'm not the one who's going to be buying, but I am a person who might in the end be the recipient of a service related to your technology. And science-led startups tend to struggle with that. They tend to think like, oh, strategic communication is something we can do later. Strategic communication is something you should do from the beginning. You should already start to think how to get buy-in from whatever it is your work, your process, whatever it is you're developing from the beginning. And that buy-in is not about just the investor. It's not about just the customer you're hoping to reach. This is not marketing. This is about having a narrative, an interesting story around your work and what you are doing. and they tend to struggle with that particular aspect of communication.
Eva, I love that and I understand because all my life I have been a journalist and I've also worked in the international development and non-profit sector. When we went to interview these people, these experts, they never had a budget for communication. They budgeted for everything except communication. And they just assumed that because they had a good product, people would buy it. So I think that is where the missing link is. And because these people are very technical, it's also very difficult to communicate. And unlike other products, you cannot fake it until you win it. So they have to find a way around that. For somebody who is probably listening, give us a few tips how a good communication strategy looks like and key communication tips on how to market your product and service.
Before I actually do that, there's something I want to point out because this was a revelation for me. When I was at university and when I met this colleague, quite instrumental in my journey, he's called Edwin Collier. So when I was working with him at the university, it was when I discovered that science communication or research communication is actually a profession in itself. It's not something where you just bump into. There's actually master's degrees that offer it. I came later also to even find out that the UK is leading in this. So there is a lot of research and science communicators in this country. And there's a couple of other countries and the US also. This is actually a thing in the US as well. It's a profession. It's an area that people go into. And what normally happens if there's anybody who's actually a scientist and they're thinking of different career paths. So what normally happens is most research communicators or science communicators, they have a degree in basic science. Their bachelor's is in a specific field, biology, or they might be coming from physics. I remember once in our company, we had an intern who was an astrophysicist. She had decided that actually she doesn't want to go into that and she wants instead to be around like research engagement, science communication. So she'd gone on to do a master's around that. So that's what normally happens. So what you find with research communicators is that they're specialists themselves. And they are like, I'm a science communicator, but my specialist is in medical science, or my specialist is in energy, or my specialism is in physics, environmental, atmospheric science. So they are also specialized. The difference is, so they are specialized in that science, but they are specialized also in creative writing. And that is, I think, the part that is so important for me to point out. So these people come with the skill of understanding the foundation of the research of whoever they are working for. And then because they have the training around this journalistic writing, creative writing, they're able to translate that complexity into that simple narratives. Typically, what happens in our company when we are working with different clients, such funders, we've worked with researchers, we work with startups as well. We first begin by asking them, what does success look like for you? At the end of this, once we are done with this piece of work, what do you envision as a great outcome for you? It might be that you want, by the time we have worked with you, you want that maybe you're recognized nationally as the go-to company, or you just want visibility, or maybe you even want a specific policy maker to engage with you, or perhaps you just want visibility, or you just want people to come to you, potential customers, potential partners. Maybe that's what you're looking for. So we start first by asking you that, because the strategic communication and the strategy of developing a communication should be based on that success, right? It's a bit like developing, anybody who understands social science, it's a bit like developing your theory of change, what change you're hoping to see. Once we understand what that means, then we start to discuss with you that for you to get there, what you need to do. So we talk about things like your audience. Who do you want to reach? Who is it you really want to get your message? Is it anybody? Like, is it the general public? Is it a specific segment of the general public, or is it like a certain like audience of, it might be policymakers or private businesses, or who is it you want your message to reach to? Then we collect evidence across your organization. That evidence should be things like what your innovation is about. We'll ask you questions. So we'll do an interview. We ask you what are you working on? Try to get your journey. How did you get there where you are now developing what you're doing. And then we'll discuss about even challenges you've had, how maybe sometimes those challenges have impacted your work, whether negatively or positively. So we gather as much information as we can around you. And the evidence can be either through like interview, or it can be documentation. Maybe you have some publications you did before, and then you need to do a synthesis of this evidence to create a kind of image of what the company is about. Then you start to now build a strategy based on that. So here on one hand, you already know who you want to reach, and then now you have this evidence that helps you to see what the company is about, what the innovation is about, what are they trying to do, what if there's a change they're trying to bring into society with their product or solution. You get an idea about it. You also see the landscape in which they are working, and then you develop the strategy based on that. So the strategy in itself is not content. A strategy is a path. It's something that shows you what you need to do to get to the success story. A document that shows you the pathway. So in a strategy, you're going to have things like what you're going to do specifically. So you might say, based on this, who we want to reach, we are going to start doing some podcasts, blogs, or we are going to start maybe going to events to present about our work. So it helps you to know what things you're going to do. So the actual doing itself is called content production. So if you do the podcast, you've done content production. When you go to the event, you've done content production. If you post something on LinkedIn, you've done content production. So those are very different things. The strategy is the pathway, and then to show you what kind of content or activities you need to do. So those are the main things. Now, there's a key part which tends to miss, and this is something Edwin and I have been sort of talking and integrating. So normally with research communication and any communication, even marketing, there is a tendency to measure what you're doing is good by looking at things like how many people clicked on our page. And those metrics don't tell you anything. If I look at how many people, so for instance, now Raziah is doing this podcast. If she tells me 100 people listen to this podcast, but as to whether it's an indication of whether you learned anything from the podcast, I cannot tell, right? I know you clicked on it, you might have listened to it, but I'm not able to tell at all whether you learned anything from it. And this is something my colleague Edwin and I have introduced, which is called this like communicating with impact. So we go beyond metrics. So once you have your strategy, you have your audience, you have your content, we go beyond looking at how many people read your LinkedIn post, how many people clicked on that podcast. We try to gather data about what people have done with the information that they've gotten. So for instance, we find out the people who looked at the LinkedIn post, what are they thinking about it? Are they thinking that maybe they'll now come to the company to form partnership? This is something Edwin, I must give credit to Edwin for this. So when he was working at the university, he used to work in research impact, and we saw that there's a lot of that knowledge that could actually be integrated into communication that is currently missing. So going beyond metrics. I feel a bit like I've been very technical in that description, Raziah.
Well, you have not been technical. You've just been saying the same things people say in your own language. Because when you talk about the strategy is a roadmap to get you where you want, knowing what does success look like and the people you want to communicate to. It's all about marketing, knowing the persona of the people, the activities, where these people are, what appeals to them. It's more of the same language, but then it's just translating that into a language that fits more into science. I also love that you go beyond the metrics. Most people are fascinated with the clicks and how many have retweeted, how long a person has stayed. The most important is the engagement. So after reading it, what comes out of it? It is something that I already knew, and I love that you put it so clearly for people who are researchers. These are very important things that people should think about when they are thinking about their research, because most of them think, after I've written this paper, I have published it, I've gone to this conference, there were 5,000 people, 3,000 people, that is it. And so many people congratulate you, but then so what? What follows is the most important thing. Thank you very much, Eva, for bringing this up. You've talked about the communication gap, how to communicate this. Okay, so now let's talk about the AI, the trust, and the communication gap. The fragmented communication, where investors, partners hear one language and the public hear another language, and how damaging and inconsistent this can be. Because you can have a good product, but if you don't give the right message, it might not reach the right people, because people buy things because of the advertisement that they see. Tell us about ICE. Exactly what is it, and how is it solving this problem?
How ICE has come about has not been through choice, it's been driven by market forces. So this is not something we ever thought we would be doing. It was not planned, so it was not an intentional sort of product that, it's not something that was at the back of our mind where we were working on it and have now reached the point where we are launching it. No, that's not what happened. It's purely been driven by market forces, and as far back as maybe science communication can be thought of, it's always operated the same way. Science writers are, most of them are people with a scientific background who then develop skills around this creative writing, journalistic skills, and things like that. And in terms of how then they work in the market, many of them tend to have like agencies. For instance, our company is an agency, right? So we are a science writing agency. And there's lots of those around, and you'll find big ones, small ones, freelancers. And for instance, the UK has so many freelancers who work as science writers, running these micro companies and things like that. So this is how it has always operated. And then we woke up one day and ChatGPT had come into the picture. You can imagine your entire career has been around generating content. And suddenly this AI comes into the sector, and a manager or an academic or whoever it is sitting somewhere in a room, and suddenly they can just ask this AI, can you write for me a LinkedIn blog post about this new research that I am doing in a language that engaging with LinkedIn can understand. And ChatGPT does that in seconds. So that's what happened to our sector. So we found that before, while the work used to come from these massive, either like innovators or research organizations or research funders, they started taking that work in-house. So they started asking, for instance, people working in their teams as project managers to become also writers of narratives, right, around the work they were doing. Most organizations tend to make decisions around cost, right? So it was cheaper to ask ChatGPT than to get an agency like ours to do the work. But as people, as companies and organizations started to bring that work in house and start using AI, they also started to see problems. How generic the content that was being produced by these generative AI platforms was. They also started to see how there was sort of missing that thing that makes content human, right? So there's a very specific tone that when you're a human being, you're not perfect. So sometimes even like certain flaws of sentences and how we write, it brings out your personality. But with these generative AIs, those human elements were missing. So you find that maybe organizations started to see like, regardless of their uniqueness, they were all producing things that looked the same. So they might go to LinkedIn and find that their competitor has text that sounds exactly like theirs, right? And then there were also other things that emerged. Anybody who's tested generative AI, I think you're all aware about issues which have emerged on hallucinations. The AI coming up with its own things, it starts to create things that are false and false information. I'll give you a very quick example. I was writing an academic paper recently, and I found that it would give false references. But when you look at the reference, it's following exactly like maybe a specific style like API, but that reference does not exist. There's no writer like that. There's no book like that. And it's put it there as though it were a real reference. So these have emerged as a big problem. And then there's the issue of trust as well. There's also that mistrust around the AI keeping for its own self and for the companies who are providing it to us and things like that. We had discussion in our company, and two things were clear. One is that once companies or organizations find a cheap option, they're very unlikely to go for an expensive option unless there's a very good reason to do that. Right now, in research communication, the business is not in yourself trying to use generative AI. There's no point to do that. Companies are doing that themselves internally. The business is actually in supporting companies to build a robust process within their own organizations where they can use these generative AIs, but safely. So they use it safely in terms of making sure that while they're using it, they're happy with what the output, the content, they're happy with the security elements. And that is how our product ICE came about. So we are not coming up with something which I don't want to say it is like, it's not the telephone. It's not like we've invented the telephone. I don't think anybody's inventing anything new now. And maybe this AI is the only invention we'll see in another, I don't know how long. But what we are doing is we are looking at what we used to do or what we've always done, which is we have this human intelligence, we have this ethical way of how we work with clients, how we protect clients' innovations, and we are translating that into an automated process which the clients can take in-house and use by themselves. Because we know that now also the issue of cost has become a very, very big thing. And it's quite difficult for clients once they've had experienced something at lower cost, it's difficult for them to actually then go back to something higher cost. So that is what our product is about. So we are currently in alpha testing. So we are in the process of building sort of the prototype, and then we are going to test it with a few science-led startups so that we can see if it will actually do what we want it to do. And the main things that we are looking at is, first of all, can it be trusted? So is it producing content? Is it producing a strategy that can be trusted so that when these science-led startups use it, they don't feel like it hasn't hallucinated, it's not saying things, claiming things that are not true. And then the other thing we are looking at is cost. How much would it cost them to be able to use this kind of automated process in-house?
Thank you, Eva. It's all about not automating things. You're not reinventing the wheel because like everything you are doing has already been done, but you're trying to make it more responsible and you're trying to give it a human feel that although it's going to be AI, but then it has that personal touch, that personal feel that they will feel this content has not been really watered into something else. Thank you for highlighting the differences between the system that you are building and the normal AI, because they say that necessity is the mother of invention. And you've tried to create something that is not outside the box, but is inside the box. It is something that can be used, ethical, something that can be trusted, cannot alter the language, theme, and the content. Looking forward, do you see ICE simply as a communication tool or as part of our infrastructure needed for the future of innovation economy?
I would like to think of it as something that will help also science-led startups. So the reason I now say science-led startups is because that's the first segment of customers we are looking at. But to be honest, this ICE could pretty much be adopted by anybody, right? It could be taken by universities, it could be taken in by research funders, anybody who's interested in it, especially people in the science or research space, they could very well take it. So I just say science startups because that's the primary market we are looking at first. Other than it being sort of helping these target customers see that they can use this solution that's specifically been designed for this scientific community. Because when you think about the generative AIs that exist, and we've been looking quite a bit, we haven't yet found any platform or any AI tool that has been designed specifically for the scientific community in communication. There are tools that exist for other things, like you might know Elicit, which is being used for writing academic papers. There's also other platforms that have been developed for instance, if you want to do literature review or literature search, like academic literature search, those exist. specifically related to research communication. We haven't yet found, and especially strategic research engagement, we've not found anything. There are some as well that exist around marketing, right? General marketing is you trying to sell your product specifically to your customers. Intentionally target your customers. You know where they are, you know who they are, and you start targeting them only. Strategic communication is you reaching beyond your customers. It's about you creating visibility and buy-in of your innovation to a wider audience. So it's not about selling, it's about telling and showing about your work to the public, policymakers, to other different segments of the communities with the purpose of buy-in. So you want people to understand your work, and also strategic communication can also involve communicating internally. So it's about how you communicate internally with your team around what you are doing, so that everybody in the organization is sort of aware and has sort of the same view and understanding of what the company is about and what the company does. So people tend to confuse these two things together, and they're different. So in terms of ICE, I see it as move away from just being a tool into an infrastructure. When an organization is thinking about what they need to do to operate, the same way they say, oh, we need an accountant, we need to have these IT systems, we need to have this, that they are going to say, we also need to have this platform, because strategic communication is central and part of our process. It's no longer an afterthought. It's no longer something they think about later. Once the startup has already launched and is scaling up, that's when they're starting to think, oh, we should have done this strategic communication from the beginning. Instead, they already think about it from the beginning, and they make this communication part of their infrastructure and operations. That is how I would want to see ICE become. So the shift from us making this communication an outsourced element, which is what, as an agency, that has always been the thing. We are now building this thing where they can actually embed it into their operations. So ICE becomes this platform which they can embed within their own organization, and they can use it their own staff. So they wouldn't need to hire, for instance, our company or our experts to be part of their team. This is something they can do within their own company. Very different from them hiring like our company, the same way you would hire consultants, which is a very different thing. So that is the future I see for this. First testing, before we even test the content production, we are first testing how good of a strategy it can build. So we are looking at whether what we are developing so far does as good a job as what our science writers do.
You are solving a problem in your industry, more of an infrastructure system embedded in the organization and in their systems to make their life easy. A one-stop shop, one platform that can be used by anybody, where you can have all your communication, you can have your strategy. You are listening to Discovering Africa Through Technology podcast, where we spotlight African expertise, global solutions, and innovation with human impact with Eva Kagiri-Kalanzi, one of the founders and innovators of ICE. If this conversation resonates with you, make sure you subscribe, share this episode, and join a growing community committed to reframing Africa through innovation, truth, and human-centered technology and impact. So, Eva, as we continue with this conversation, let's talk about the African expertise perspective. As an African expert working in global science communication, innovation ecosystems, what unique perspectives do you think all researchers, and especially African innovators and professionals, bring to solving the global technology challenge in terms of communication?
Yeah.
And communicating their research and impact?
Before I went into research communication, I had no idea about the breadth and depth of knowledge that exists in the sector. So I didn't know, where do you find these research communicators? Where are they? Is it, and I think in the beginning, being in the UK, I really thought, it's very well established in the UK, but I didn't know how well established it is in other places. But in the last couple of years, I've been very happily surprised by meeting African based research communicators. And I've met quite a few now. I've actually befriended a few on my LinkedIn as well. Unfortunately, I think many of them, when I look at, just looking at the ones I know, they are based in big organizations. So you'll find that somebody is based, for instance, in international facing organization, or then they're part of like a big African fund organization, or if they're in a university, they are like in a bit of a private prestigious university, if I can say that. And I haven't met many who are in other, like maybe smaller, less resourced institutions, which where there's also a lot of innovation that's coming out, right? So this is the discrepancy, I think, in that. So there is people who are experts in this same area or who are working in this sector, but they're just not that many everywhere. And I think this is also because of that issue around recognizing the value. I think there's a lot of innovations and ideas that emerge from small universities, companies. I remember before I actually started working more and more closely with higher education, I worked a lot with incubators, African-based, and myself, I think I have established maybe 2 or 3 companies in Africa, specifically in Kenya and one in Uganda. So I understand exactly like also how businesses are established, in that context, and the resources they have. So I also know that there is a lot of innovations that are happening, and there's a lot of startups within that ecosystem that have emerged or are emerging from research and science, and they might not even be coming from coming from higher education. These are people who have like very good understanding of, say, like certain technologies. There's quite many innovations, for instance, that have come up around things like digital and ICT things, or technology specific to energy. I've seen many of those, and some of the people who I meet who come up with those innovations, they don't even have like a master's degree or anything like that. They might have a bachelor's degree, and then they've decided to branch out into developing something very unique, like maybe a mixed irrigation system powered by solar. I've seen those kinds of things, many of those kinds of things, of startups and ideas. I think the issue is always priorities in such a low resource setting. So here you are, you have money maybe to build the innovation, and the money is not even a lot. You definitely then don't have money to be able to create these narratives and stories around your innovation. And even if you had the money, you may not have the expertise. So then you're left thinking that, let me concentrate on building the technology or the innovation, and then I will think about the communication around it later. The most important thing, I think, is that because such innovations coming out of Africa are working already with constrained resources, there is an opportunity to train innovators and researchers around communication. It doesn't need to be a specialist area. It doesn't need to be, like here in UK, it's a very specialist area. If I'm an academic, although now it's becoming more and more prominent in universities for them to be trained around social media engagement, because it's become the thing for visibility as well for academics. They're being taught more and more around communicating their research. There's a lot of work being done around that, being told how do you do social media engagement, how do you write blog pieces, policy briefs. So researchers are being taught that way more in universities here than I even saw ever before. And I've done quite a bit of that kind of work myself. And I think that's maybe something that's missing in the African context, being able to equip people with that skill as well, helping them think like, okay, you are definitely very good at coming up with this idea, building this idea, but also we train you how to talk about this idea, and we train you how to talk about this idea to different people, because sometimes you might need to talk to a policymaker, sometimes you might need to be talking to a funder, sometimes you might even just be needing to talk to the public. You might go to an event where you need to talk to the public about it. So it just equipping innovators with that skill is something that maybe could be done a bit more.
I agree with you, because when you work in a resource constrained situation, you need to prioritize. And that we also need to invest in communication, because at Discovering Africa Through Technology, we believe Africa is producing world-class solutions, but also lacks that visibility. And as much as people invest a lot of money to create these startups, to fund a lot of innovation, they should also invest more in communication, because communication is also a part of the innovation. And for them to succeed, they need to hype up their game and invest more also in communication, because if you have a lot of innovations that people do not know about them, there's no point of having those innovations, because innovations are supposed to be known and they're supposed to be used, piloted to change and transform people's lives. So now let's talk about this communication gap. You've worked in Africa and you've also worked in Europe, communicating science. How is the problem for the African researchers and the Western researchers? Is it the same problem, or how is the magnitude? And how can the Africans leverage on what they have compared to what they don't have, to use communication strategically to create more visibility and buy in and reach more people with their research and innovation?
We need to understand the foundations and fundamentals of how the research and innovation systems in these two spheres are designed, right? If you take, say, the European context, and this is also very specific to different countries. So let me take a country like maybe the UK, because the example I'm about to give, the UK has been doing this for decades and decades in comparison to other European countries. Education in this country, especially higher education, is a product. It's not a service, it's designed as a product. So what that means is that it is sold the locals, so people who live in the UK, and it is also sold internationally. And that means that any communication that comes out of a UK institution is purely around emphasizing and increasing visibility of this product. A university, and this is also the same with the US, it's the same with maybe Australia, and it's the same with any university that is especially interested in attracting high paying fees applicants into their institution. So the education becomes a product in that sense. So when you look at, for instance, any university in the UK, their website, just go to any website, you'll see how well they are articulate the research work that the institution does, their teaching, their R&D activities, anything that's coming out of that institution is highly articulated. And because the idea is to increase visibility, it is to sell this product. So the institution and what the institution is offering, that's the whole idea. Now, universities in the African context, they are not designed as products. Not everybody is currently able to go, say, to a university. They are engaged in teaching. They're not trying to attract international students into their institutions. They already have enough students locally who are dying or driving, trying to get into those institutions. So they're not trying to sell or attract any international students to come and study there. It's not about that. Take any university, don't take private ones, please. Take a public university in an African setting, and I want you to compare the websites of these two institutions, and you'll see like a massive difference of how they communicate about their institutions. And that's because of the foundation, what they think or that their mandate is as institutions. This means that even when now they get to the point of you are an academic in, say, a UK university, and then you are an academic in an African university. When you are an academic in a UK university, the institution puts great effort into equipping you with knowledge and even sometimes pushing you to become more visible as a researcher. We want to see our academics being more on LinkedIn. We want to see them appearing more on interviews with BBC, and they put effort towards that. So they do that internally. And I'm saying this because I used to work also at, like I said, I was at the university before, and I used to work for like the policy think tank of this university. So my job was to link like the researchers with parliament. And so it was all about evidence-based policy making. And I was one of these people really organizing like this different workshops where I'll bring people from the UK Parliament into the universities to teach their academics about how to engage with Parliament and how to get their research into like different parliamentary processes. So, the machinery was there within the university to support that, right? So, and you can see like how the foundation of the university and what the university sees as its mandate, and where especially how it looks at income and where income is coming from and how that affects the effort it puts into these visibility and communication elements. So there is definitely a big difference between the problems an academic in a UK institutions and the problem an academic in an African institution is facing when it comes to communication. For an academic in the African institution, this is probably something that's not even on their mind, right? They might not even be thinking that I need to do this more. They might be thinking that I just need, first of all, I have so much work, I need to just get through that work. And you see that and that's why you see that for most African academics, their visibility comes from attending conferences. It comes from them traveling outside of the country, trying to go to different places. But when you look at their digital footprint, it's normally quite low. It's not it's not as heavy as maybe the digital footprint of an academic that might be in a UK institution. And I think maybe this is also where the issue is. This misconception that you don't need that digital footprint, that what I need is really to go to these conferences to find partners. Yes, you need to do that, but we are moving into an era where the things are right now. I'm sure when many of you hear my name, the first thing you're going to do is to Google me. That's the first thing. And this is what's happening now. So even a professor in whatever place, the first time they hear about you as an innovator, the first thing they're going to do is to Google you. So that digital footprint is becoming more and more important. So the challenges they are facing are very different challenges. The challenge a UK academic is facing is more one of ethical. To what extent do I become open, or to what extent do I become closed? So the conversations I see happening between, like with researchers, is mostly around, oh, this platform is toxic. Like, like for instance, when Twitter became X, many of academics moved from Twitter and they went to Blue Sky. And I've been in conversations where they're saying, oh, things became very toxic on X, insults, all sorts of things. And now we've moved to Blue Sky. At least there people are civil. You can talk about your research and your thoughts in an environment where people actually they interact without resulting to negative and toxicity. So those are the kinds of discussions that I see researchers, for instance, in a UK or European environment contending with. But from an African perspective, it's the aspect of, first of all, do I even have time to be on X or Twitter or LinkedIn or wherever posting things about my work?
How do you see the future of communication evolving for science-led tech startups over the next 5 to 10 years?
I think we are at a point where this buy-in of innovations that are coming into market is becoming more and more prominent. Couple of decades ago, what companies used to do, or companies when they innovated, they never used to think too much around public buy-in. It was mostly like trying to get like an investor maybe to invest into the development process, and then perhaps after that they would go directly into like just looking at the customers and things like that. But people, the public, the general public, have become very active in also identifying innovations that are coming into the market, which they are for or against, right? And mostly for us, we are working with science-led startups that are working in areas where the general public is very interested. So if you're looking at things like technologies on climate, or you're looking at technologies or solutions that are being developed for, say, medical or bio life sciences, those are the areas we work with. So these are innovations that the public is very, very interested in. And even though they do not understand the technology behind it, they are very much interested in the impact of these innovations. That is what the public is interested in. So this buy-in of the public has become very, very important. And I think this is what maybe also makes what we are doing with AISCE quite timely, as science-led startups are also seeing and recognizing that. So they recognize that they need to be open around what they're doing and what their innovation is about, maybe more than they could have been before. But we also know, and they know that they are also themselves resource constrained at that stage. At startup stage, it's not like you're flowing in money. So also they are looking for a low cost solution to be able to do that. And that's what we are trying to help them do with AISCE. So I think in the future, companies are going to be scrutinized more by the public. This is the scrutiny I see. It will become that, you can no longer now just launch something and assume that you can do it without at least explaining or openly saying what your innovation can and cannot do to the public. You cannot make, before people I think used to make all sorts of claims, right? It's becoming more and more difficult now to hyperclaim. Maybe that's what I should say. So that scrutiny is going to become one more, and that means that the need for this like science communication will become greater, in the sense that you want somebody, or you'll need a way to be able to talk about the innovation without overclaiming, but at the same time making whatever your innovation is about clearly understood to the public.
You are talking more about democratization of research, more open research. It's not like before you just create something and you dump it. People are becoming more critical and they're becoming more concerned about their lives. Thank you very much. Do you believe communication will become as important as the technology itself in determining which innovations succeed globally? Yes or no, and why?
I don't think it will become more important. I think they will be both as important. I think so. Traditionally, what has happened is there has been a drive, maybe that the technology is the one that has been prominent, and in the sense, maybe that's also because there has been sometimes a situation where the people who understand the technology, right, are the ones, it's sort of been accepted. You're going to realize that there's two groups of narratives around AI, right? First narrative is doomsday AI narrative, right? So that's the doomsday narrative, and that's the one where it's like AI is going to come in and it's going to take away all our jobs, it's going to ruin our lives, it will take over the world, and humanity will die, right? That's the doomsday narrative there. And the other extreme of the AI narrative is that AI is here to make our lives easier, it's going to make our lives better, there is huge potential for it, and we should really embrace it. I personally sit in the middle, right? I think that it's neither nor. There are definitely good things about AI, and there are also some things I'm still questioning around AI and the reach of AI. This is where I sit. Before, maybe just the AI would have just been there in the world, and maybe people would have just been satisfied with the companies building the AI, just putting it out into the market without having any discussion around it. But now, when you think about the conversations around AI, they are wider than maybe what they would have been traditionally. You're going to find that people who are not themselves even tech oriented, okay, people who are not they are not developers, they are not they do not have background in computer science, engaging in conversations around AI. And for me, that's really, really important, because it shows me that we are at a point where the communication around innovations that emerge now into humanities are no longer about experts. We are not relying on listening only to experts. We are not sitting back waiting for, I don't know, some computer scientist or some person from the companies that are making AI to tell us what these technologies are. We as the public are actually engaging in conversations around what these technologies are and what they mean for us. And this is how I see that in the future, or this is how I see innovations, like discussions around innovation are going to be like. So I do not think we are now at a point where communication and technology are both at the same par. So the communication is so wide now, it's much more around anybody who is interested in the technology, regardless of whether they are themselves having a background in the science of that technology, can engage in conversation. And that means that for innovators, you cannot ignore integrating this communication aspect into your own organization or your process. Because if you don't have that conversation, someone will have it for you. That is for sure. Because there are people now who are really looking, the public is looking, and if you yourself do not engage with the public around those aspects of your innovation, somebody else will do it for you. And then they might put out a narrative that's wrong, which is not based on truth. So you do want to have a handle on that. So it cannot be either or, it needs to be in parallel.
Me too. I am in the middle because these two narratives are really conflicting, because it's like when you want AI to do what you want, it is good. And when you don't want it to do what you don't want, it is bad. So it's a carrot and stick idea. But there are so many theories around this. But one thing I believe is that there's also responsible AI, and we can train AI to do good and not do bad. As we are almost coming to an end of this interview, one thing that stands out from this conversation is that innovation alone is no longer enough. The future belongs not only to those building powerful technologies, but also to those who can communicate them responsibly. That is what ICE is doing. Communicate their research ethically to the world. And perhaps that is a deeper message here, that science without communication risks invisibility, but communication with purpose can transform innovation into impact.
Yes, can't agree more.
Tell us about some of the challenges that you've had in developing ICE, the opportunities.
I must say we are very early in our journey. So at this point, I don't think we've faced lots of challenges yet. I suspect when I think about the innovation cycle, and anybody who's involved in innovation, you definitely know how that cycle goes. I think we are being given a breathing space. I think the problems will start when we start testing this platform. What we did though, before we started to develop the innovation, we reached out to customers with a few interviews just to gauge, first of all, how do they feel around using generative AI? What are their pain points as customers? So we did that. For us, was quite eye-opening. And for instance, we quickly found out, just as an example, that lots of science startups, and I imagine also we interviewed science startups, we interviewed some research funders, we also interviewed some community-based research organizations and some academics. And what we found out, which was common across these different groups, was that they are all aware that they cannot escape anymore using this generative AI, but they don't trust it. So trust is a big issue. And this sort of, it for me, resonates, and I think this is quite something that maybe even many African-based researchers might as well be feeling as well. You might be feeling that, okay, yes, I'm being encouraged to use ChatGPT to do things. I'm being encouraged to just use AI to produce a paper or to do, but in reality, you also know that you can't quite trust what it's producing, but also what it's doing with information that you feed it, right? So there's those elements of trust that are existing within the community, which makes sense because science without trust is not science really. And that the foundation of science and why science is such a guarded sector is because normally we believe that when results from scientific experiment or scientific research emerge, we believe as the public and anybody who's consuming that information that the people involved have really done robust work. We can trust the process they used. We can trust the theories. We can trust I don't know, the parameters of their work. And if we get to that point where people are using AI tools and these AI tools are breaking that element of trust in what we believe science is meant to be, people will already stop trusting science. And we already know there's a lot of problems with people not trusting science. That's a conversation for another day. But for instance, we know there are climate change deniers, isn't it? This is already there out there. So we are quite aware that the use of this AI is something that cannot be escaped. But like I said, we have embedded in it a process which also makes it both ethical and also makes it possible for human oversight. So this is one of the things we are doing. So for the listeners who might be interested in this kind of platform, I think perhaps there's a bit of patience required there because we are now in this alpha testing. And like I mentioned, we have first started with science-led startups. So we are not yet testing it with academics. We are not yet testing it with other actors within the research and innovation space. We are first starting with startups that emerge from, say, university spin-offs, things or have been developed through research and innovation action. So we are first starting with those startups, and then once we do that alpha testing, we are going to see, first of all, remember, this is an idea. And I think we can all agree as scientists, engineers, whatever we are, that we do not know yet if it will fail or pass. So we are also in that process. And I think come September, I'll be able to tell you, Razia, if it failed or if it passed. If people are asking you, I'll be able to respond then. I'll be able to tell you, yes, we tested it and it has passed the first test, and now we are going into the second phase. So ask me in September.
Eva, I am sure with all the details you've told us about ICE, the way it is ethical, the way it has human oversight, and also that it is a one-stop shop. There is strategy in there. You can do content, you can do everything. I am sure ICE will not die on the testing phase. Whether it is he or she, they will rise to the occasion. As we bring this conversation to an end, what is your legacy in one sentence, and what would you like to be remembered for?
I I've been asked this question before, and I sometimes wonder if my response changes with age. So when I was younger, I had very different ambitions, and I think my response then was very different. But I think where I am at now, and when I look back at everything I've done in my life, from where I started up to where I am now, and even the things mostly that excite me and the things that interest me, I think the only thing I feel that I'm constantly working towards is anything that I feel is going to bring a positive impact to humanity. And I've seen that from the things that I tend to engage with. Most of the projects, programs that I've always done, initiatives that I've involved myself in, if I cannot quite see what that social impact element is, or what is the value, I tend to struggle with such initiatives. I tend to struggle with those kinds of things, and that matters to me a lot. So I hope that anybody who meets me or who works with me, or who knows something about me, can perhaps in my old age be able to say everything she ever did, it wasn't always about money, it wasn't always about recognition, it was about looking for things that are actually going to have a positive impact on humanity.
Eva, that is very insightful. It's very humbling. Want to be remembered as somebody who did something to transform people's lives.
Thank you. Right.
That was Eva Kagiri-Kalanzi. Thank you very much for joining us today and for sharing your insights, your journey, and the important work you are doing through ICE to help science-led innovators communicate with greater clarity, trust, and impact. This conversation reminds us that some of the world's greatest solutions already exist. We only need to know them and use them. The challenge is making sure they are seen, understood, and supported. At Discovering Africa Through Technology, we remain committed to amplifying African voices, African intelligence, and African-led innovation that is shaping the future globally. Because Africa is not a passive recipient of innovation, but a producer of solutions, as we've heard from Eva. And as the African proverb says, wisdom is like fire. People take it from others. Let's take this fire, this passion, let's invest in science communication and communicate all the good science that we are doing. It is not expensive. It can be done, and we have all the resources to do that. The future of innovation will not be built in isolation. We need each other, because Eva has told us that they are building AISCE to solve a communication problem, to promote ethical AI, and to give research a human face and integrity and trust. But they're not building it for themselves. They are building it for other researchers to give them an opportunity to communicate better. The future will be built through collaboration, shared knowledge, and courageous storytelling. If you enjoyed this episode of Discovering Africa Through Technology, make sure you follow this podcast, share this episode with founders, researchers, and innovators who need to communicate their impact. As we wait for AISCE to be fully developed, Eva is still providing those services. Join the movement showcasing African solutions with global human impact. Africa's greatest challenge is not the absence of innovation, it is the silence surrounding it. And today we have heard of a solution that is killing the silence. Innovation changes nothing if it remains misunderstood. The laboratory may create the breakthrough, but communication determines whether the world understands its value. The future will not only belong to those who innovate, but it will belong to those who can help the world understand why their innovation matters. So let us build louder, let us communicate better. Do not only build solutions, but build understanding around them, because African innovation deserves visibility. African experts and expertise deserves global recognition, as we've given a platform for AISCE today. And African solutions deserve the world stage. That is why Discovering Africa Through Technology was created. Let us tell our stories before the world tells them for us, because Africa has too many solutions to remain silent. Until next time, keep questioning, innovating, building, keep communicating and telling African stories. This is Discovering Africa Through Technology podcast with Raziah Quallatein Mwawanga, defining and creating the future. African solutions, human impact, because the world cannot support what it does not understand. Thank you.